The security footage was never supposed to be seen. Captured by a forgotten camera at the back entrance of the Apostolic Archives, it showed a woman in her late 70s, dressed in gray, standing motionless under the rain at precisely 3:33 a.m. No ID, no appointment, only a small wooden box pressed tightly against her chest, and 5 words whispered to the guard. "Tell him, Marguerite is alive." The name meant nothing to the young Swiss guard, but protocol dictated caution. He called the night supervisor, who called the assistant to the secretariat, who hesitantly called the Pope's private secretary. The line went quiet for a long time. Then came a single order: do not let her leave. By sunrise, the Vatican was stirring. Morning bells echoed through marble halls. Cardinals prepared for Mass. Pilgrims gathered in St. Peter's Square. But beneath it all, in a small windowless interview chamber, the woman waited silent, composed, and unmoving. She gave no surname. She asked for no priest. She demanded nothing, only that the Pope himself see what was inside the box. "It's not for the church," she said. "It's for the man who wears the white." At 7:40 a.m., Pope Leo XIV broke routine. He did not take his breakfast. He did not meet with his advisors. Instead, he walked alone through a side passage beneath the Apostolic Palace. When he opened the door and saw her face, he stopped cold. Not because he recognized her, but because the box in her lap was covered in handwriting he knew better than his own, his mother's. She looked up. Her eyes were sharp, unafraid. "Robert," she said, "I have something you lost." He sat slowly. His pulse thundered in his ears. "Who are you?" he whispered. She didn't answer. She simply opened the box. Inside, a letter, folded neatly, the paper yellowed with time. A black and white photograph of a woman holding a baby in front of a convent wall, and an envelope marked in Latin, "Veritas liberabite." The truth shall set you free. The Pope's hands trembled. He reached for the letter. "My son, if you're reading this, it means the silence has finally broken. I never meant to deceive you, but the Church demanded obedience. They said you had a purpose greater than my love. So I gave you up, not because I wanted to, but because I was told you belonged to God, and not to me." The Pope closed his eyes. The room seemed to tilt. His mother, his real mother, had written this. And the woman across from him. "Marguerite," he said aloud, "you're not a rumor." She nodded. "No, Your Holiness, I'm your beginning." A silence fell that couldn't be broken by prayers or bells. The Vatican had been built over centuries of secrets, but never one like this. A pope who might not be who the world believed he was. A woman who claimed to have been erased by the Church. And a truth so delicate, even God might weep to hear it. The Pope did not call for his advisors. He did not alert the guards. For the first time in his papacy, he wanted to be left alone with a stranger. He stared at the box again. Not the contents, those had already shaken him, but the box itself, a simple wooden chest, worn by time. Carved into its side was a name, St. Adelaide Orphanage. He had heard it once before, in a whisper. Long ago. He looked at the woman. Her eyes never blinked. "Why now?" he asked. She tilted her head slightly. "Because I am dying." The words cut clean. There was no tremor in her voice, no plea for sympathy. Only the kind of calm that comes when there is nothing left to lose. "I was told you would never know," she continued, "that I would be erased. But you are a man of truth, not myth, and you deserve to know where your story began." The Pope leaned forward. "They told me I was the son of Anna Moretti, that she raised me in Milan until she died, that I was baptized there." Marguerite shook her head slowly. "Anne was a good woman, a brave woman, but she was not your mother. She was a sister, in the order that took you from me." She reached into the box again and pulled out a second envelope sealed unopened. This was written by her. She left it with me before she passed. The Pope hesitated. Something inside him didn't want to open it. He was terrified of the truth, and terrified of how much he wanted it. But he opened it. The handwriting was delicate, familiar, the same script that had written him lullabies when he was a child. "Robert, If ever you learn the truth, forgive me. I loved you from the moment I held you, but you were never mine. I was assigned to care for you, to raise you, to never speak of what happened. I did what the church demanded. But in my heart, I was always your second mother, your real one. She wept for years. Her name is Marguerite, and she never stopped praying for you. The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. He looked up at the woman in front of him. Her face was no longer a mystery. It was a mirror. He could see his jawline in hers, his sadness in her expression. He whispered, "I thought I had no more family." She reached across the table, placed her hand gently over his. "You were never alone, Robert. Just hidden." The Pope exhaled deeply, as if releasing decades of weight he didn't know he was carrying. And then, he did something no one had seen him do in years. He wept, not as a pope, not as a priest, but as a son. Down the corridor, the guards waited in silence. None of them dared approach. They didn't know who the woman was, but they sensed this was no ordinary audience. The Vatican had many secrets, and tonight another had surfaced. Inside the chamber, Robert wiped his face and looked at her with new eyes. "What happens now?" he asked. Marguerite smiled faintly. "That's not for me to say. I've delivered the truth. What you do with it is between you and God." He stood, walked to the small cross on the far wall. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he turned. "You'll stay here, as my guest. I'll arrange everything." She chuckled softly. "I don't need protection. I've lived in shadows for decades. I only need a few days of light." He nodded. But as he left the room, a question haunted him more than any letter could. Had his entire papacy been built on a lie? Because if his origin was false, if his identity had been crafted, then who was the man the world called Holy Father? The name had not been spoken in over 40 years. It had lived only in fragmentschaft, whispered in dreams, carved faintly in the corners of memory, forbidden in every room he ever called home. Marguerite. And now it echoed through the marble halls of the Vatican like a ghost returned from the dead. Robert sat in his private study, the heavy door locked behind him. The envelope still lay on the desk. Beside it, the black and white photograph. The child in the image could have been any infant, but the shape of the nose, the eyes, the dimple in the left cheek. He didn't need confirmation. He had seen that face every morning in the mirror. He had built a life on certainty, on structure, doctrine, vows. But now, even the foundation beneath his name felt like sand. He stared at the crucifix on the far wall. "Lord, what if I was never meant to wear this robe?" His voice cracked. "What if my whole life was someone else's design?" There was no answer, only silence, and the faint sound of rain tapping against the stained glass. The Vatican was waking up around him. Schedules were being followed. Guards moved. Bells rang. But Robert remained frozen still, gripped by the impossible truth that the woman he buried as his mother might never have given him life, and the one who did had just reappeared to claim him. A soft knock at the door. It was Father Luca, his closest aide. "Holy Father, your first audience is waiting." "Cancel it," Robert said flatly. Luca hesitated. "May I ask, is something wrong?" Robert turned slowly, his voice steadier now. "No, something is finally beginning to be right." Later that day, he returned to the chamber where Marguerite waited. The box had been closed. Her hands rested gently over it, as if guarding something sacred. She looked up as he entered. No bow, no ceremony. "Did you read it?" she asked. He nodded, sat across from her. "You said they took me from you. Who were they?" She took a deep breath, looked down, then whispered, "The Congregation of Guardians." He blinked. "That order was dissolved before I was born." She shook her head. "Officially, yes, but not truly. They still exist, not as monks, but as shadows. They don't wear robes, they wear titles, and they sit in rooms like this one." Robert felt the blood drain from his face. "And why? Why would they take me?" She looked directly at him. Because your father was one of them. And because I refused to let them baptize you into the order. They said you were destined. I said you were mine. Tears welled in her eyes, but her voice didn't break. So they made me disappear. The Pope stood and began to pace. The walls felt smaller now. I need proof, he muttered. Not just letters. Records, witnesses, something. She reached once more into the box and removed a final item, a chain. At the end of it, a pendant, tiny silver, worn. Engraved on the back, RDM, Robert D. Marguerite. His heart stopped. He didn't remember ever seeing it, but somewhere deep in his bones, it felt familiar, like something that had once hung above his crib. He took it gently, fingers trembling. How did you keep all of this for so long? She smiled sadly. Because one day, I knew you would come looking, or I would bring it to you. Outside, the Vatican was preparing for a televised mass. Cameras were being installed, flowers arranged, choirs rehearsed. None of them knew that inside the papal residence, the man at the center of their church was unraveling. Robert returned to his room and opened his Bible. Inside, dozens of marked pages. But today, one verse called to him above all. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Jeremiah 1:5. He read it over and over, unsure if it was a comfort or a curse. As night fell, Robert made one final call. Anonymously, securely, through a line known only to a handful of Vatican historians. This is a confidential inquiry, he said. I need the full record of every child born in St. Adelaide Orphanage between 1973 and 1974. The man on the other end hesitated. That file was sealed, Your Holiness. Robert lowered his voice. Unseal it. He had seen the box before. Not this exact one, no, but in dreams, in flashes, in the trembling hands of imagination trying to remember what it never truly knew. The texture of it, the smell of aged wood, the soft creak of the lid. It wasn't just an object. It was a coffin, a memory chest. And now, it sat on his desk taunting him. The Pope stood over it like a man confronting a grave. No audience, no advisors, no guards. Just him, the box, and a silence that pressed against the walls like a living thing. He placed his hand over the lid, felt the ridges carved into the wood, and closed his eyes. His breathing slowed. The world outside blurred into a hum. Then he opened it. Inside, everything was carefully arranged. Not a collection of objects, but of moments, threads of a life hidden beneath another. First, the photograph. It was the same he'd seen the day before, a black and white image of a woman holding a baby wrapped in coarse cloth. Behind them, the chipped bricks of a convent wall. At the bottom corner, barely visible, a date. August 14, 1974. His birthday. He turned the photo over. There was a name written on the back. Robert Mofilo, and beneath it, in smaller letters, Que Deus te protea, und quer que te levem. He swallowed hard and set it aside. Next came a bundle of letters. Dozens, maybe more. All sealed. All addressed to the same name, Father Thomas. He didn't recognize it. Each envelope marked with dates across years he couldn't recall years when he was still a child. One every 6 months. None ever opened. He reached for one and cracked the seal. The ink was faded, but still legible. Father Thomas, I write again with no answer, but with hope. Please, just tell me if he's alive. I don't ask to see him, only to know if he's well, if he's safe, if he smiles sometimes. I cannot sleep without hearing his name. Please. The paper trembled in his hands. He could almost hear the voice behind the words. Desperate, controlled, full of the kind of grief that can't be spoken aloud in daylight. He read 5 more, then stopped. He could no longer breathe. There in that box was the story no one ever told him. The story the church had erased. Not just a mother's face, but her pain, her loyalty, her agony. And yet, no bitterness. Only love. Always love. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the tears fall. He didn't try to stop them. He didn't pray. Not yet. Even prayers felt too heavy now. He stayed that way until the chimes of St. Peter's rang 5 times. Then he stood. He walked to the fireplace, lit only by the dying embers of a morning flame, and reached for the final item in the boxa, leather-bound journal, unmarked, no title. Inside, it was Marguerite's handwriting again. But this wasn't a letter. It was a record. A day-by-day log. The first entry. They took him today. Said it was God's will. I screamed. No one listened. I walked home with my arms empty. I touched my stomach where he used to be. I begged God to curse them. And then I begged him to forgive me. He flipped forward. He turned 3 today, I think. I bought a candle and didn't light it. I don't want to celebrate a life I can't see. Another entry. I saw a photo in the paper. A bishop blessing a young seminarian. He had Robert's eyes. I almost fainted in the market. Could it be? My heart says yes. My mind says I'm a fool. He closed the book. He understood now. This wasn't a revelation. It was a resurrection. The past had not been buried. It had been preserved, waiting for the day he was ready to face it. And now it stood before him raw, unfiltered and sacred. But one question still echoed. Why had no one told him? Why had this truth been locked away? By the very institution he had vowed to serve. He turned, picked up the old envelope marked in Latin Veritas Liberabit Te and held it to his chest. The truth will set you free. But what if it destroys everything first? He walked to the window. The sun was breaking through the clouds over Rome. The crowd in the square moved like a single body, unaware that the man inside the palace was unraveling. His world had split in 2. Pope on one side, sun on the other. And, in the space between them, a box. The gates of St. Adelaide had long been closed to the public. What was once a vibrant orphanage run by nuns had become a forgotten annex of the church's vast social archives. A place where records were buried under bureaucracy and memories faded in dust. But the Pope had access to keys that others didn't. That morning, under the guise of a private visit to a rural diocese, Pope Leo XIV left the Vatican in an unmarked car with tinted windows. No robes, no entourage. Just 2 discreet companions from the pontifical archives and a folder marked confidential tucked beneath his coat. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, not even Matteo. The journey was quiet. No one dared speak. Rome gave way to open roads, and open roads to narrow countryside paths lined with olive trees and aging stone walls. When they arrived, the building looked more like a mausoleum than a home for children. St. Adelaide was still there, still standing, but it breathed no life. Robert stepped out into the morning fog. The cold bit into his skin, but he welcomed it. The pain made everything feel real. At the gate, a small plaque had been worn down by time. Only the words, Caritas et Silentium, remained legible. Charity and silence. How fitting. Inside, the old sister who greeted them looked startled when she saw his face. Holy Father, she whispered, bowing deeply. We weren't told. And no one else must be, he interrupted gently. I'm not here as Pope today. She straightened slowly, her eyes scanning the 2 men behind him. You've come, for the records? He nodded. From 1970, 3 to 1974, every name, every baptism, every file, and every hidden one, too. Her lips tightened. There was hesitation. Then, reluctantly, she motioned toward a door at the end of the hall. They're in the cellar, behind the chapel. You'll need gloves. He followed without another word. The descent into the archives felt like descending into memory itself. Each step downward brought with it the weight of things forgotten, discarded, buried. In the basement, the smell of mildew mixed with the scent of old paper and candle wax. Dust danced in the light of their flashlights. Rows and rows of boxes lined the stone walls, alphabetized, dated, some crumbling. They began the search. Hour after hour, Silence reigned, until one of the archivists called out softly, "Your Holiness, I believe this is it." He rushed over. The folder was small, thinner than he'd expected, labeled only with the year and a red stamp, restricted. He opened it. Inside were 3 names. Just 3. 2 had been crossed out in black ink. The third, Roberto, entry 33A. No surname, no parent signature, only a note. Transferred to private care by ecclesiastical order. He flipped the page. No baptism date. No adoption records. Only a notation in Latin. Infant accepted for preparation under direct supervision of Father T. Father T. The same name on all the letters Marguerite had sent. He turned to the sister beside him. Who was Father T? Her face paled. "You don't want to go down that road, Your Holiness." He stepped closer. "I'm already halfway down it. Help me walk the rest." She looked away, clutching her rosary. He was an advisor to the Congregation for Clerical Formation, assigned to special vocations. He passed many years ago. What kind of vocations? Her eyes filled with water. Ones chosen before the children could choose for themselves. He felt the rage rising in his throat, swallowed it. Turned back to the file. There was one more item inside. A photograph. A group of infants on a worn blanket. 5 nuns standing behind them. One priest in the center. Tall. Thin. Eyes like winter. Father Thomas. Holding a baby. His baby. Robert stared at the face. His own face. He didn't remember it being taken. Of course he didn't. He was too small. But the body remembers what the mind forgets. His hands began to tremble. He took the photo, placed it in his coat pocket, and turned to leave. As he walked back up the stone steps, every sound, the creak of wood, the crunch of old leaves, sounded like a confession. He wasn't angry. Not yet. But the cracks in the facade were widening, and the man who had once been a servant of silence was now a seeker of truth. The drive back was even quieter than the way there. Back in the Vatican, he returned to his quarters, sat by the window, and looked out at the city of saints and sinners. And then he whispered, not to the sky, but to the box on his desk. They didn't just choose me, they made me. But what they didn't realize, what they never expected, was that the boy they built would one day question the architects. And now he would. The Vatican's medical wing was a fortress within a fortress, shielded from public view, guarded by discretion, and equipped with technology far more advanced than most imagined. It was here that popes were monitored, treated, and when necessary, hidden. That afternoon, Pope Leo XIV entered not as a patient, but as a man on a mission. He handed the sealed envelope to the attending physician with one instruction. Run a comparison. Use the saliva sample inside. Match it to mine. Don't ask questions. Don't inform anyone. I want results within 72 hours. The doctor didn't flinch. He had worked under 3 popes. He knew the weight of secrets. Yes, Your Holiness. Robert left without another word. What he didn't say, what he couldn't say, was that the sample belonged to Marguerite. A swab taken from the inside of her cheek while she slept, placed carefully into the envelope, sealed with trembling hands. He told himself it wasn't deceit. It was protection. For her. For him. For whatever truth might follow. Back in his chambers, he lit no candles, opened no scripture. Instead, he paced. Back and forth, like a man awaiting sentence. Because that's what it was, wasn't it? Not a revelation. A verdict. If the test came back positive, the Vatican wouldn't just face a scandal, it would face a contradiction. The Holy Father, born not from divine circumstance, but from a stolen childhood and a silenced mother. He sat down, thought of his speeches, his titles, the way people wept in St. Peter's Square when he blessed them. They didn't know the man behind the robe. Not really. They knew the symbol, the story, the version. And now, that version was cracking. 3 days passed. He didn't sleep, he didn't eat. He performed his duties with mechanical grace, his mind always circling the same storm. On the third morning, a letter slid beneath his door. No signature, just a white envelope with a red wax seal. He stared at it for a long time, then opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. DNA comparison result. Subject A, Pope Leo XIV. Subject B, anonymous female sample. Result, 99.98% probability of biological maternity. He exhaled. But it wasn't relief. It was collapse. He sat down slowly. The page trembled in his hands. He had known. Since the moment she looked into his eyes and called him Robert. Since the moment she touched the photo and whispered his name like a prayer. But knowing is one thing. Proving is another. This wasn't a story anymore. This was blood. This was bone. And now the most powerful religious figure on earth had a truth in his hands that could dismantle everything. He looked out the window at the sky over Rome. Gray, heavy, pregnant with rain. He thought of her, sleeping 2 floors below, unaware that her truth had finally been confirmed. And he thought of himself, not the Pope, but the child. The child who had grown up believing he was chosen, who now realized he had been taken. He walked to the mirror, looked into it, not at the cassock, not at the papal ring, at the eyes. And for the first time in decades, he didn't see holiness. He saw a boy who had been rewritten, who had lost his name before he could speak it. He took the paper, folded it carefully, and placed it inside his Bible, right next to the drawing Pedro had sent last year. The truth was no longer a mystery, but it was still a secret. And now came the hardest question of all. What would he do with it? She was waiting for him when he entered, sitting upright on the velvet armchair, hands folded neatly on her lap, as if she were about to begin a confession. Marguerite didn't ask if he had read the results. She already knew. He closed the door behind him and sat across from her. No documents, no cassock, just his presence, his breath. She looked into his eyes. So, now you know. He nodded. Silence filled the room like incense heavy, sacred, suffocating. Why didn't you come sooner? He asked finally. Why wait until now? Her gaze didn't waver. Because they watched me for years. They followed my every move, every letter I tried to send, every inquiry I made. I was warned if I ever tried to contact you, they'd make me disappear again. For good. He leaned forward. Who are they? She hesitated, then answered with the clarity of someone who had rehearsed this truth for decades. The congregation of guardians, the same men who took you, who erased your name, who orchestrated your future. They don't exist anymore. Not officially, but their spirit does. In councils, in hidden votes, in the secret corridors of this place. They don't wear uniforms now. They wear trust. Robert stood. He began to pace. Why me? Why take me of all children? She answered with a voice that trembled just slightly. Because of who your father was. He stopped, turned to her. You never mentioned him. She looked down. Her hands tightened slightly. He was a cardinal. His name is gone from the records now. Wiped. He was part of the order, but he fell in love. With me. With a woman from the outside. She paused, her voice thinner now. When I became pregnant, he begged them to spare us. He said the child might be important, that you were meant for something great. Robert's heart pounded louder. And so they took me. Yes, but not in kindness. Not to protect you, to control you. He sat down again. I thought I was chosen by God. You were chosen by men, but that doesn't mean God wasn't watching. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thin booklet, faded, handwritten. This is the journal your father kept, before he died. He wanted you to have it one day. Robert took it slowly. His hands were steady now. He opened to the first page. If anyone ever reads this, know that I sinned. I broke my vows. I loved a woman. I fathered a son. But I never stopped believing in God. I only stopped believing in men. He read in silence, page after page. his father's words full of sorrow, devotion, doubt. Not the thoughts of a rebel, the thoughts of a man caught between heaven and human hands. When he looked up, his face had changed. The weight was no longer confusion. It was fury. But it was a calm fury. The kind that doesn't erupt. It unfolds. "They built my life," he whispered, "from the ground up, not to serve God, but to serve a plan." Marguerite nodded. "And now you know." He stood again, slower this time. He walked to the window and opened it. The evening air swept in. Cool. Alive. "They said I was born to lead, that my path was sacred." He turned back to her. "But maybe the sacred path begins now." Marguerite smiled softly. Her eyes, old and tired, glimmered just a little. "So what will you do?" He looked back out the window, where St. Peter's dome glowed beneath the fading light. "I don't know, but I won't be their son anymore." Chapter 7. The Collapse. At first, no one noticed. The masses continued. The smiles remained. The Pope's hand still lifted in blessing. His speeches still carried the same resonance. But something inside him had cracked subtly, deeply. Like the foundation of a cathedral shifting ever so slightly under centuries of weight, he began forgetting names, misplacing notes, losing time in the middle of meetings. Father Luca was the first to voice concern. "You seem distant, Holy Father." Robert smiled, but his eyes didn't match the expression. "Just tired." But it wasn't fatigue. It was erosion. Each morning, he looked in the mirror and saw the ghost of the boy he used to be. The child who once believed in stories about his birth, his destiny, his sacred place in the grand machinery of God. Now he knew better. He hadn't been chosen by heaven. He had been selected by design. And the cost of that lie was beginning to collect. Behind closed doors, his temper flared. At night, he walked the corridors of the apostolic palace like a restless spirit, hands clasped behind his back, lips muttering prayers he no longer felt. He started missing appointments. He avoided confessions. The palace staff whispered. Something was wrong. Even Matteo Visconti, his oldest mentor, took notice. "Robert," he said gently during a private supper, "I don't need to know the details, but I can see the war inside you." Robert sipped his wine, stared at the candle between them. "Have you ever looked at your life and realized it wasn't yours?" Matteo didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence between them was enough. After that night, Robert stopped sleeping. He lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the papal ring on his finger like a shackle. One morning, during a private mass, his voice cracked in the middle of the gospel reading. He paused, lowered the book, and simply walked away. The cardinals stared. The cameras froze. But no one followed him. Back in his chamber, he locked the door and fell to his knees. He wept, not loudly, not dramatically, just a long, slow release, like a dam opening in silence. He reached for the box again. Marguerite's journal, his father's letters, the photograph, the DNA result. He placed each item on the floor, one by one. Then, finally, he picked up the rosary that had once belonged to the woman he thought was his mother. Anne, the one who raised him, who never spoke of the truth, who kissed his forehead before his first sermon, who called him Figlio mio until the day she died. "I'm sorry," he whispered. He didn't know to whom. To Anne? To Marguerite? To God? To himself? Outside, bells rang for vespers. Inside, the Pope held his head in his hands and whispered a confession that no one would ever hear. "I don't know who I am anymore." The collapse wasn't public. It was private, quiet, but it was real. And it had begun. The summons came in the form of a letter. No insignia, no signature. Just a folded page slipped beneath his door with 5 words handwritten in Latin. "We must speak. Alone. Tonight." Robert knew who it was before even opening it. Cardinal Bellardi, the man who smiled too often during silence, who nodded in public but listened only in private, A cardinal of perfect posture, polished shoes, and eyes that never blinked. They met in a forgotten chapel beneath the apostolic palace, one used only during conclaves, its stone walls absorbing sound like secrets. Belardi was already waiting. Alone. No guards, no robes, just a black cassock and that same unblinking gaze. Robert entered quietly. "You've heard," he said, not asking. Belardi didn't nod. He simply raised one brow. Enough to be concerned. Robert sat across from him, placing no barriers between them. "Then let's speak plainly." The cardinal folded his hands. "You've been distracted, withdrawn. There are whispers, files accessed, trips made in secret, conversations off the record." "Is that a crime now?" Robert asked, his tone steady. "No," Belardi replied, "but recklessness is contagious." Robert didn't blink. "And truth?" A pause. "Truth," the cardinal said, "is a matter of timing." Robert leaned forward. "You mean concealment?" Belardi's smile was small, tired. "I mean responsibility. You were chosen not just to lead, but to protect. If the world knew you were not who they believed, they would still believe in God." Belardi's eyes flashed. "Would they? Or would they question every word, every prayer, every sacrament you've ever touched? You are the face of faith for billions. If your foundation crumbles, what stands behind it?" Robert stood. "Something more honest than what they built for me." Belardi stood too. "If you expose this, you'll fracture the church." "No," Robert said quietly. "You already did that. I'm just shining a light on the crack." They stood face to face now. Not pope and cardinal, not leader and advisor. Just two men, one clinging to control, the other peeling it away. Belardi's tone dropped. "You think this is about you. It's not. This is about the chair of Peter, about 2,000 years of unity, about nations, treaties, souls." "It's about power," Robert replied, "and fear. It's about order, built on a lie." Belardi stepped closer. "So what will you do? Stand on the balcony and tell the world you were taken from your mother by a secret order? That you were molded like a relic for public display? That even your name was never yours?" Robert's breath caught in his throat. Because that was exactly what he had considered. He turned away, facing the old stone altar. The light from the single candle flickered like a nervous heartbeat. "I won't lie anymore," he said. "Then you'll destroy yourself." "Maybe." Belardi sighed, picked up his gloves, slid them on slowly. "You have a choice, Robert. Protect the truth, or become it." Robert looked over his shoulder. "I already have." Belardi walked away without another word. His footsteps echoed down the narrow corridor until they disappeared. Robert stood alone, in the cold chapel, beneath centuries of silence. But this time, he felt no fear, only clarity. He lit another candle, then another, until the altar was full of light. The night before the Mass of Saints, the Vatican was silent in a way that felt unnatural, the kind of silence that settles just before a storm, when even the wind forgets to move. Inside his chambers, Robert stood before a mirror not to adjust his vestments, not to practice a speech, but simply to look at himself. The white cassock hung clean and unblemished. The papal ring reflected the soft light from the golden sconces. He looked every bit the Holy Father. But he no longer felt like one. He saw it in his posture, the way his shoulders drooped slightly, as if the cloth no longer carried conviction. He saw it in his eyes tired, restless, too full of memory. Most of all, he saw it in the subtle tremble of his hands when he placed them over his heart. Tonight, the man in the mirror was not a pope. He was a son with two mothers, a man with two lives, and a truth demanding a voice. He walked to the window and opened it wide. Below, St. Peter's Square slept in silence, save for the soft murmur of security and the distant steps of a Swiss guard patrolling the perimeter. Beyond that, the world turned unaware, waiting for a sermon they didn't know would change everything. On his desk, the box remained, unmoved, untouched since that afternoon. But inside it, everything had shifted him. Robert walked to it now, like a pilgrim returning to a relic. He opened the lid. He took out the photo of Marguerite, younger, smiling faintly as she held him in her arms. He had stared at that image a dozen times over the past weeks. But tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't looking at the woman in the photo. He was looking at the child, the one who had never known the truth, the one who had prayed every night to a God he thought had chosen him when, in truth, it was men in robes who had drawn the map of his life before he'd learned to speak. He sat down and took a deep breath. He knew what they would say. They would call him ungrateful, a scandal, a betrayal to the throne of Peter. Some would say he had lost his mind. Others would claim he had never truly belonged. They would cite doctrine, tradition, scripture, but none of them knew what it was like to be born into a lie so perfectly built that even love became a myth. None of them had Marguerite's voice in their ears. None of them had her journal beneath their hands. None of them were her son. There was a knock. Father Luca entered quietly, holding a tray. "Tea, Your Holiness. You've barely eaten." Robert looked up, offered a faint smile. "Thank you." Luca hesitated. Then softly, "Do you need anything else?" Robert studied him. Luca had served him for 7 years. He had seen the rise, the peace negotiations, the declarations of unity, the speeches that had drawn tears from presidents. And still, he had never asked a personal question. Not until now. Robert stood, walked over, and placed a hand on Luca's shoulder. "If I asked you to stay, would you?" Luca's eyes searched his face. "Always. Even if the world turns away?" The young priest nodded without hesitation. Robert felt a weight lift from somewhere deep. Not gone, but shared. "Then I need you to prepare a statement," he said, "for after the Mass, one that does not deny, one that does not lie, one that tells the world I am ready to speak the truth." Luca's expression didn't change. "Yes, Holy Father." He turned to go, but paused. "Is it about the woman?" Robert froze. "You knew?" Luca hesitated. "We all heard the name. We saw your face after her first visit. And those of us who love you have wondered if maybe there was more to your light than just divine favor." Robert smiled. For the first time in days, it was genuine. There is. Luca bowed and left without another word. Robert returned to the window. The bells of midnight rang softly in the distance. Tomorrow, he would speak. But tonight, he needed to remember. He returned to the box. He unfolded Marguerite's final letter, the one she had written when she first came to Rome. Not for confirmation, not for recognition, just to be heard. "Robert, you don't owe me anything, but I owe you everything. I should have fought harder. I should have screamed louder. I should have torn down the doors of every cardinal who stole your name. But I was afraid. Now I am not. If you remember anything of me, let it not be the silence. Let it be the voice I give you now, the voice you were never supposed to find." He placed the letter against his chest. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lit a candle. And then another, until 10 flames danced across the surface of his desk, surrounding the photo, the journal, the letters, the chain. One for each year she waited for him. When the final flame was lit, he knelt before them and whispered, "I see you now." He didn't ask God for strength. He didn't ask forgiveness. He only asked for the courage to finish what had already begun. Tomorrow, the bells would ring. Tomorrow, the balcony would fill with light. And tomorrow, for the first time, the world would see a pope who chose to be human before being holy. The sky over St. Peter's was heavy with clouds, as if even the heavens were unsure how this day would unfold. Thousands had gathered in the square, not for a holy day, not for a proclamation. There had been no announcement, no agenda, only a whisper. The Pope will speak. No one knew what he would say. But they came. Elderly women clutching rosaries, journalists with cameras and hands already shaking, tourists who didn't even understand the language but felt the weight in the air, priests, skeptics, believers, cynics. all of them drawn by something deeper than tradition. They came for truth. Inside the palace, Robert stood before the door to the balcony. He wore white, not because it was required, but because it had always meant something. Purity, unity, illusion. Today, it would mean something else. He glanced once at Father Luca, who stood nearby with eyes glistening. Luca gave a slight nod. Robert turned and stepped outside. The wind caught his robes like wings. The crowd gasped not in fear, but in reverence. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't smile. He walked slowly to the microphone and looked out. He saw them all. And in the front row, almost too perfectly placed, he saw a woman holding the hand of a small boy. It wasn't Marguerite. She was gone. But the image struck him with the force of memory, of rebirth. He took a breath and began. My brothers and sisters, I speak to you today, not as a ruler, not as a figure in white, but as a man, a son, and a soul like yours. The square fell utterly silent. I was raised to believe I was chosen, that my life had been carved by divine hands, that I had a mission from God, pure and perfect. His voice was steady, clear, without theatrics. But recently, I discovered a truth that shook me more deeply than any war, any betrayal, any moment of doubt I've ever known. The camera zoomed in. Lips parted, pens froze above notepads. I learned that my origine identity was crafted not by providence, but by human hands, that I was taken as an infant, that my mother was erased from my story, that I was shaped for power before I ever had a choice. A gasp, audible, real. He continued, some of you may say, why share this? Why now? Why open wounds that could remain hidden? He paused, because silence is no longer holy when it protects a lie. He turned slightly, looking across the sea of faces. I am the son of a woman who prayed for me in secret, who wept for decades in the shadows of this very institution, a woman named Marguerite. He placed a photo on the podium. It was her, young, radiant, holding a baby. This is the face that loved me before the world ever knew my name. The crowd was still. Some wept, some watched in stunned silence. I do not renounce my faith. I do not walk away from the church. But I do tear down the wall between the truth and the altar. He stepped back slightly. I am not here to scandalize. I am here to humanize. I am not less holy for having been lied to. I am not less worthy for being born of love instead of legacy. He looked toward the sky. And if God watches us now, then let him see a church that no longer fears the light. Then he did something no pope had ever done. He removed the papal ring, held it in his hand, looked at it one last time, and set it gently on the podium. Today, I give back the symbol, not the spirit. I will no longer be called Holy Father. I will simply be a father. From the crowd came the first sound-soft sobs, then applause, hesitant at first, then rising. People embraced. Others knelt. Others just watched, unable to process what they had witnessed. A pope who had not been defeated, but transformed. Robert stepped back. Luca met him behind the curtain, eyes full of fire. What now? Robert smiled faintly. Now, we build something true. As the Vatican bells began to ring, not for coronation, not for mourning, but for awakening, a boy in the front row tugged at his mother's sleeve. Mama, what did the Pope say? The woman wiped her tears, bent down, and whispered, he said he's one of us.